Detective Miller's hand shook so violently he nearly dropped his gun. The air in apartment 404 was freezing, yet he was drenched in sweat. He wasn't looking at a suspect. He was looking at a silver police badge lying in the thick gray dust on the floor. He knelt down, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. With a trembling finger, he wiped the grime off the metal. The name engraved on the badge was Detective Miller. His breath hitched. He reached up to his own chest. His badge was right there, pinned to his uniform. He looked back at the floor. The badge in the dust was scratched, dented, and covered in what looked like dried blood. It looked 20 years old, but the date on the back of the badge was for a year that hadn't even happened yet. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sarah, look at this." His partner didn't answer. Sarah was standing by the window, her eyes wide and vacant. She wasn't breathing. She wasn't moving. She looked like a human statue frozen in a moment of pure, silent terror. 2 hours earlier, the sun was shining and life was normal. Miller was at the precinct complaining about his cold coffee and the mountain of paperwork on his desk. He was a man of logic. He believed in fingerprints, DNA, and hard facts. He didn't believe in the supernatural. Then the call came in. A neighbor at the Blackwood Apartments reported hearing a loud, rhythmic thumping coming from apartment 404. The problem? That apartment had been welded shut by the city 5 years ago. No one had been inside since a mysterious fire claimed the lives of a family of 4. Probably just a squatter, Miller sighed, grabbing his coat. He joked with the desk sergeant that he'd be back in an hour for the department pizza party. He had no idea this was the last time he would ever feel like a normal man. As they pulled up to the building, a heavy silence hung over the street. Miller noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hundreds of birds were lying dead on the sidewalk. There were no marks on them, no blood, no struggle. They had all just stopped. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sarah, look at this." His partner didn't answer. Sarah was standing by the window, her eyes wide and vacant. She wasn't breathing. She wasn't moving. She looked like a human statue frozen in a moment of pure, silent terror. Miller turned around to open the door, but there was no handle. The door was a solid sheet of smooth, cold steel. He looked at the wall next to it and gasped. Taped to the wall was a crime scene photo. It showed a man lying dead on the floor of this very room. Miller leaned in closer, his vision blurring. The man in the photo was wearing Miller's clothes. The man in the photo was Miller. "Don't move, Sarah. Don't you dare touch that!" Miller's voice was a jagged scream, echoing off the peeling wallpaper of apartment 404. Sarah was sitting at a grand mahogany dinner table that hadn't been there 2 minutes ago. Her hands were hovering over a silver fork. On the table sat 4 plates of steaming hot beef stew, the rich aroma filling the room. It looked delicious. It looked like a mother's Sunday cooking. But Miller wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at the steam. The steam wasn't rising into the air. It was flowing downward, pooling on the tablecloth like heavy white silk. "I'm so hungry, Miller," Sarah whispered. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like a little girl's. "My mom said I could eat once the guests arrived. You're the guest, aren't you?" Miller grabbed her shoulder to pull her back, but her skin felt like ice. When she turned her head to look at him, her eyes weren't brown anymore. They were solid, terrifying white. Only 10 minutes had passed since the steel door had vanished behind them. Miller had been staring at the crime scene photo of his own dead body, his mind spinning in circles. He tried to tell himself it was a prank, a sick, twisted joke played by the guys back at the precinct. "Sarah, we need to find another way out," Miller said, turning away from the wall. But the apartment was changing. The hallway that should have led to the bathroom now stretched out for what looked like miles. The walls weren't made of wood anymore. They were covered in a soft, pulsing fabric that felt like human skin. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on her holster. From the kitchen, the sound of a humming melody drifted through the air. It was a lullaby, one Miller recognized from his own childhood. They walked toward the sound, their boots clicking on the floorboards. They entered the kitchen and stopped dead. The room was spotless. A radio from the 1950s sat on the counter playing music that shouldn't have been possible to pick up. But the real horror was the calendar hanging on the fridge. It was open to the current month, but every single day was crossed out with a thick red X. Except for today. Today's date had a circle around it. Inside the circle were 3 words written in shaky, childish handwriting. "They are here." Miller pulled Sarah away from the table, his heart nearly bursting through his chest. He backed into the kitchen counter, knocking over a small framed photo that was face down. He picked it up, expecting to see the family that had died in the fire. Instead, he saw a picture of Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah as a police officer. It was Sarah as a 6-year-old girl standing in front of this very apartment building. In the photo, she was holding the hand of a tall man whose face had been violently scratched out with a knife. Miller looked at Sarah, but she was gone. The chair at the dinner table was empty. Then the radio in the kitchen cut to static. A deep, distorted voice crawled out of the speakers. "Detective Miller, why did you bring her back? You know what she did to us." "Sarah, if you can hear me, scream!" Miller roared, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He was standing in a hallway that shouldn't have existed, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The beam of light hit a massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror at the end of the dark corridor, but when the light touched the glass, it didn't reflect the hallway. It reflected a forest, a dark, snowy forest with black trees that looked like twisted fingers reaching for the sky. In the reflection, Miller saw Sarah. She was running through the snow, her police jacket torn, her face covered in scratches. Behind her, a tall, thin shadow was gliding over the white ground, moving without making a single sound. It was gaining on her. Miller punched the glass, trying to break through to her, but his fist hit something soft. The mirror didn't shatter. It rippled like water. His hand sunk into the cold, slimy surface of the glass, and something on the other side grabbed his wrist. Just 5 minutes earlier, the kitchen had been filled with the static of the radio. Miller was staring at the photo of a young Sarah, his brain refusing to accept what he was seeing. "Sarah?" he called out, spinning around. The kitchen was empty. The dinner table was gone. The smell of fresh bread had been replaced by the metallic, stinging scent of old blood. Miller ran into the living room, but the furniture was moving. The couch was sliding across the floor on its own, and the wallpaper was peeling off in long, wet strips, revealing thousands of tiny handwritten names carved into the wood underneath. He looked at the names. They weren't just random people. He recognized them. They were every person who had gone missing in this city over the last 50 years. "No, this is impossible," Miller whispered. He found a door he hadn't noticed before. It was painted a deep, bruised purple. He pushed it open, hoping to find Sarah, but instead he stepped into the infinite hallway. The air here felt heavy, like he was walking through thick syrup. Every step he took felt like he was carrying lead weights on his feet. That's when he heard it, a soft, wet clicking sound coming from the ceiling. He looked up. A black liquid was dripping from the light fixtures. As it hit the floor, it didn't splash. It began to crawl toward his boots, forming into the shape of a human hand. Miller pulled his hand back from the rippling mirror with a violent jerk. His wrist was bruised, not by a hand, but by a heavy iron shackle that was now locked around his arm. He looked at the floor where he had fallen. The dust had been wiped away by his struggle, revealing a hidden compartment in the floorboards. Inside was a small leather diary. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and elegant, but the words were a nightmare. May 12th. Today, my daughter Sarah helped me hide the first one. She is so brave. She didn't even cry when the screaming started. She knows that in apartment 404, we have to feed the shadows to keep the world safe. Miller looked up at the mirror. Sarah was no longer running. She was standing perfectly still in the reflection, staring directly at him. She slowly raised a finger to her lips, a cold, dark smile spreading across her face. "I trusted you," Miller screamed, his voice breaking as he backed away from the mirror. Sarah, or the thing that looked like Sarah, didn't speak. She just pointed a pale finger at the wall behind Miller. The drywall began to pulse. It didn't just move, it breathed. A slow, wet thump-thump sound vibrated through the floorboards, shaking Miller's very bones. Suddenly, a long, jagged crack ripped through the wallpaper. Instead of wood or brick behind the wall, Miller saw something that made his stomach flip. It was a giant, lidless human eye, staring directly at him from inside the structure of the building. "It's hungry, Miller," the Sarah in the mirror whispered, her voice echoing from every corner of the room at once, "and it hasn't had a detective in a very, very long time." The floor beneath Miller's feet turned soft, like sinking sand. He tried to run, but the iron shackle on his wrist was bolted to a chain that was being pulled into the wall. Only moments before, Miller had been staring at the diary in total shock. Sarah helped hide the first one. The words burned into his brain. His partner, the woman who had saved his life 3 times in the line of duty, was the daughter of a monster. "Sarah, tell me this is a lie!" Miller yelled at the empty hallway. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the diary to his chest. He needed to find an exit, any exit. He ran back toward the kitchen, but the kitchen was gone. In its place was a long, narrow room filled with rows of old, rusty filing cabinets. Miller pulled one open. Inside weren't police reports. They were jars. Hundreds of small glass jars filled with a thick, glowing blue liquid. Each jar had a label with a name and a date. He found one labeled, Sarah, age 6. Inside the jar, something small was swimming. It looked like a tiny, glowing spark of light. As Miller touched the glass, the spark went dark. At that exact moment, a cold wind blew through the room, and the lights began to flicker in a rhythmic pattern, like a heartbeat. Thump, thump. The filing cabinets began to bleed. The blue liquid started leaking out from under the drawers, pooling around Miller's boots. He realized then that these weren't just jars, they were souls. The apartment wasn't just a place, it was a pantry. Miller fought against the chain, pulling him toward the wall. He grabbed a heavy metal lamp from a side table and smashed it against the drywall, trying to kill the giant eyes staring at him. But as the wall crumbled, he didn't find a monster. He found a hollow space packed tight with old yellowed missing person posters. Every single poster featured the same face, Detective Miller. But the dates on the posters spanned 50 years, one from 1976, one from 1994, one from 2012. He wasn't the first Miller to come here. He was the 10th. The Sarah in the mirror leaned forward, her face pressing against the glass until it distorted. "Don't you get it yet, Miller? You don't solve the case. You are the case. You've been here for a century. You just keep forgetting." Please, just let me die." Miller's scream was raw, his throat burning as he clawed at the floorboards. He wasn't fighting the shadow anymore, he was fighting himself. Across the room, 5 other men were huddled in the corners. They were all wearing the same tattered brown leather jacket. They all had the same scar over their left eyebrow. They all had the same silver wedding ring. They were all Detective Miller. One Miller, looking to be in his 80s, crawled toward him with hollow, weeping eyes. "It doesn't end, Ten," the old man wheezed, his voice a ghostly rattle. "She brings us here, she feeds the wall, and then she turns the clock back. You're the 10th one this century. I was the 3rd. The old Miller grabbed Ten's hand, and his skin felt like dry parchment. "Look at the window, Ten. Look at what's really outside." Miller looked. Beyond the glass wasn't a street or a city. It was a vast, endless junkyard of police cars, stretching as far as the eye could see. Thousands of them, all identical to his own. 10 minutes earlier, Miller had been staring at the missing person posters with his own face on them. The Sarah in the mirror had vanished, leaving only a cold, dark void behind the glass. "I'm not a loop," Miller growled, his detective instincts kicking in even through the terror. "I'm a man. I have a home. I have a wife waiting for me." He grabbed a heavy metal chair and smashed the breathing wall where the giant eye had been. The wall didn't bleed. It crumbled into thousands of tiny white teeth. Behind the teeth was a narrow crawl space that smelled of ozone and old paper. He crawled inside, the iron shackle on his wrist dragging behind him with a rhythmic clink-clank. The crawl space opened into a massive circular room. In the center sat a giant brass machine that looked like a cross between a clock and a furnace. The ticking was deafening. Tick, tick, tick. Every time the gear turned, the room around him flickered. For a split second, the room would be a beautiful nursery, then a bloody crime scene, then a vacant, dusty apartment. "The reset button," a voice whispered. Miller turned his flashlight toward the sound and saw them, the others, the versions of himself that didn't make it out. The oldest Miller pointed a shaky finger at the brass machine. "Sarah doesn't run this place, Ten. She's a prisoner, just like us. She's the bait." Miller walked toward the machine. On the side of the brass furnace, there was a small glass window. He peered inside and gasped. Floating in a pool of golden liquid was a heart. It was still beating, wired into the gears of the machine. But it wasn't a human heart. It was made of clockwork and glowing blue energy, the same energy he had seen in the jars in the kitchen. Attached to the heart was a small metal tag. Miller wiped away the grease and read the name, Sarah's Soul. "If you break it, the loop ends. But if the loop ends, Sarah dies. And if Sarah dies, we never existed at all. That's why the police quit, Ten. They didn't quit the job, they quit reality." Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open. The real Sarah walked in holding a tray of freshly baked bread. She looked at all the Millers and smiled a heartbreakingly sad smile. "Dinner is ready, boys. Who wants to forget first?" "Eat the bread, Miller. It's the only way the pain stops." The oldest Miller was shoving a piece of warm golden crust into his mouth, his eyes rolling back in his head. As he chewed, the scars on his face began to fade. The terror in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dull, happy glow. He was forgetting. He was becoming a blank slate, ready to be restarted. Miller looked at the tray Sarah was holding. The bread wasn't steaming, it was glowing with that same haunting blue light from the soul jars. "If I eat this, who am I?" Miller grabbed Sarah by the shoulders, shaking her. "Am I just a battery for this building? Is that why the police files on this place were empty? Because everyone who comes here becomes a ghost?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop smiling, that fixed, robotic smile. She held a piece of bread to his lips. "If you don't eat, the shadow gets to come out of the wall, and the shadow is much hungrier than I am." From the darkness behind the brass machine, a massive, spindly hand, 10 feet long and blacker than coal, wrapped its fingers around the ceiling. The thump-thump of the building turned into a deafening roar. Only moments before, Miller had been staring at Sarah's soul inside the clockwork machine. The realization that she was a prisoner, forced to feed versions of him to a hungry apartment, shattered his heart. "There has to be a way to break the machine without killing you," Miller whispered, his fingers tracing the cold brass. "There isn't," the fifth Miller said, sitting on the floor and staring at nothing. "I tried to smash it. The building just grew a new floor. I tried to burn it. The fire turned into butterflies. This place is a living lie, 10. You can't fight a lie with a fist." Miller ignored him. He began to pull at the wires connected to the clockwork heart. As he pulled, the room began to scream. Not a human scream, but the sound of metal grinding against metal. The temperature in the room plummeted to sub-zero. Sarah entered then, her footsteps light and airy. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like the partner he had trusted for a decade. She looked like the woman who knew his favorite coffee order and his darkest fears. "Detective, you've always been so stubborn. That's why the machine likes your soul the best. It tastes like justice." Miller pushed the tray of bread out of Sarah's hands. It shattered on the floor, but instead of crumbs, hundreds of tiny silver police whistles spilled out. He looked at the iron shackle on his wrist. It wasn't just a restraint. He noticed a small keyhole on the side of it, one he hadn't seen before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own house keys. The smallest key, the one to his diary at home, fit perfectly. With a loud click, the shackle fell off. But as it hit the floor, Miller's legs gave out. He looked down and saw his body beginning to turn transparent. He wasn't a man anymore. He was becoming a shadow. "The shackle wasn't keeping you prisoner, Miller," Sarah whispered, her smile finally breaking into a look of pure horror. "Without it, you're just another memory for the walls to eat." In the corner of the room, the shadow, the true master of apartment 404, fully emerged. It didn't have a face. It had a badge where its heart should be. "Now, it can't be you," Miller gasped, his body flickering like a dying light bulb. The shadow stood 10 feet tall, its body made of shifting black smoke and static. It didn't have eyes, but Miller could feel its gaze burning into his soul. As the creature stepped forward, the shadow Sarah began to peel away like burnt paper, revealing what was underneath. It was wearing a police uniform, a uniform from the future. The name tag on the creature's chest didn't say Miller, it said Sarah. The creature raised a hand of smoke and touched Miller's cheek. The touch didn't burn. It felt like 1,000 cold needles piercing his skin. Miller looked at the real Sarah standing by the door. She was fading too. Her skin was turning to gray ash, falling to the floor in silent clumps. "I told you, Detective," the shadow Sarah whispered, her voice a chorus of 1,000 screams. "The police didn't quit because they were scared. They quit because they realized the police were the ones who built this place." Before the shackle had fallen, before his body turned to ghost smoke, Miller had been convinced he was the hero of this story. He had reached for his house key, thinking that a piece of his real life would save him. "I'm getting us out of here, Sarah," he had promised, his voice full of a courage he didn't truly feel. He had unlocked the shackle, expecting freedom. Instead, the moment the metal hit the floor, the walls of the room dissolved. The brass machine, the other Millers, the dinner table, it all vanished. He found himself standing in an empty white void. In the center of the void sat a single desk. On the desk was a folder titled Project Mirror, 4th Precinct. Miller opened the folder with hands that were now see-through. Inside were blueprints of apartment 404, but it wasn't an apartment. The blueprints showed a massive underground machine designed to harvest regret from the city's finest officers. The 4th Precinct hadn't been abandoned. It had been moved inside the machine. The shadows weren't monsters. They were the concentrated guilt of every officer who had ever failed to save a victim. "We needed a way to never fail again," a voice boomed through the void. Miller turned to see the chief of police, the man who had given him his badge 20 years ago. The chief looked exactly the same as the day Miller graduated, but his eyes were leaking that same blue liquid from the jars. The chief pointed at a monitor on the desk. It showed the real world outside the apartment. The city was perfect. There was no crime. No one was crying. No one was dying. "How?" Miller whispered. "Because every time a crime is about to happen, the machine eats the memory of the criminal, and the fuel for that machine is the soul of a detective who is willing to suffer forever." Miller looked at the shadow Sarah. He realized she wasn't a prisoner. She was the Sentinel. She had been the one choosing which Miller to harvest next. But then Miller saw something the chief didn't. In the blueprints, there was a small red dot labeled the escape hatch. It wasn't a door, it was a person. Miller looked at his own transparent hands and realized why the other Millers had failed. They tried to stay human. To win, he had to become something much worse than a shadow. "You want my soul?" Miller's laugh was a jagged, terrifying sound that made the shadow Sarah freeze. "Then take all of it. Every dark thought, every lie I ever told, every person I let walk away." He grabbed the shadow's smoky throat with his transparent hands. The blue light in the room turned a violent, sickening purple. Miller wasn't praying for help anymore. He was opening the basement of his own mind. The machine began to groan. The brass gears of the furnace started to smoke, the smell of burning rubber and ozone filling the void. The chief's perfect face began to melt, his skin dripping like hot wax. "Stop it, Miller!" the chief screamed, his voice distorting. "You're poisoning the system. If the machine fails, the city will burn." "Let it burn," Miller hissed. "I'd rather be a monster in the real world than a saint in a cage." Moments earlier, Miller had been staring at the blueprints, realizing the horrible truth. The peace of the city was bought with his eternal suffering. "The escape hatch isn't a door," Miller whispered, his eyes narrowing. "It's an error." He looked at the chief, then at the shadow Sarah. To the machine, Miller was just data, a file of the hero detective. But Miller had a secret. Before he was a cop, he had done things, dark things, things he had buried so deep even he had forgotten them, until the apartment forced his mind to open. He reached into his chest and pulled out a memory. It wasn't a glowing blue spark, it was a jagged black shard. It was the memory of the night he had let a criminal go because he was paid $1,000 to look the other way. It was the one time Miller hadn't been a hero. It was his original sin. The machine can't digest a corrupt cop, Miller realized. He walked toward the brass furnace, the shard of black memory pulsing in his hand like a dying heart. The other Millers in the room began to scream, their happy glows turning into shadows. They felt the poison spreading through the network. Miller shoved the black shard into the heart of the machine. For a second, there was total silence. Then, the golden liquid inside the furnace turned black. The real Sarah screamed, not in pain, but in release. Her gray skin began to turn back to flesh and blood. But as the machine broke, the white void began to crack. Behind the cracks wasn't the city. It was the 4th Precinct, but it was filled with water. Deep, dark, freezing water. Miller looked at the monitor one last time. The perfect city was disappearing. In its place, people were waking up in the middle of the street, screaming as years of forgotten crimes and memories hit them all at once. "You've killed them all," the chief whispered as he dissolved into ash. "No," Miller said, his body finally becoming solid again. "I just gave them back their lives." But as the water rushed in to drown the room, Miller saw the final reveal. The escape hatch dot on the blueprint wasn't moving toward the exit, it was moving toward him. The shadow Sarah wasn't a sentinel, she was a leech, and now that the machine was dead, she needed a new home. The water didn't taste like salt, it tasted like tears. Miller was pinned against the ceiling of the 4th Precinct, his lungs screaming for air as the freezing black water rose higher. Above him, the office lights flickered and popped, sending sparks dancing across the surface of the flood. Through the murky water, he saw Sarah. She was swimming toward him, her movements fluid and graceful like a shark. But she wasn't trying to save him. She had a pair of heavy, rusted handcuffs in her hand, the same ones that had been used in the very first Project Mirror case 50 years ago. "If we drown together, the memory never dies," she gurgled, bubbles of black ink escaping her mouth. Miller kicked out, his boot hitting her chest, but she felt like a ghost. His foot went right through her. He was fighting a memory, and you can't punch a thought. As the last pocket of air vanished, Miller closed his eyes, ready to let the darkness take him. Only minutes before, the brass machine had exploded into a million shards of glass and gear. The perfect city on the monitors had vanished, replaced by a terrifying sight. In the real world, thousands of people were standing in the streets, clutching their heads and screaming. The peace had been a lie, and the truth was hitting them like a freight train. "What have I done?" Miller whispered, his solid hands shaking. "You set them free," the voice of the dying chief echoed through the room. "But freedom has a price, Miller. The machine wasn't just holding your soul, it was holding the flood." Suddenly, the floor of the white void cracked open. A roar like 1,000 thunderstorms filled the air. Millions of gallons of black water, the regret of the entire city, began to pour in. The 4th Precinct, which had been hidden in a pocket of reality, was being submerged. Miller grabbed a floating desk, trying to stay above the rising tide. He saw the other Millers, the older versions of himself, being swept away. They didn't fight. They smiled as the water took them. They were finally allowed to stop existing. But Miller wasn't ready to stop. He saw a vent in the ceiling, a small square of light that looked like the only way out. Miller grabbed a heavy metal file cabinet and threw it at the vent, smashing the cover. He pulled himself up, gasping for the last bit of oxygen in the room. As he climbed into the ventilation shaft, he looked back down into the water. The shadow Sarah was gone. In her place, thousands of people were floating in the dark water. They weren't dead. Their eyes were open, staring up at him. They were the victims of every case the police had ever closed by using the machine. They were the unsolved mysteries that had been wiped from the city's mind. And then Miller saw the most terrifying face of all. Floating right beneath him, reaching out with a pale, cold hand, was a woman he recognized from a photo on his own nightstand. It was his wife, the wife he thought was waiting for him at home. "Miller," she whispered through the water, "why did you think I was at home? You're the one who put me in here." "I'm sorry," Miller whispered, the words lost in the roar of the rushing water. He wasn't looking at his wife anymore. He was looking at the silver police badge in his hand, the one from the future. The metal began to glow with a blinding white heat. As the water swallowed him whole, Miller didn't fight to reach the surface. Instead, he swam down, deeper into the heart of the drowning precinct. He reached the very bottom, where the foundation of the building met the bedrock of the city. There he saw a giant circular mirror embedded in the floor. In the reflection, he didn't see himself. He saw the empty, sunny street outside the Blackwood apartments. He saw the birds flying. He saw the world as it was supposed to be. But to break the glass and let the truth out, he had to become the key. Miller gripped the badge and slammed it into the center of the mirror with every ounce of strength he had left. The glass didn't shatter, it screamed. 10 minutes earlier, Miller had been staring at his wife's face in the dark water. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't lost her in a fire. He had lost her to his own ambition. Years ago, when the machine was first built, Miller had been the first volunteer. He wanted a perfect world so badly that when his wife committed a crime, he didn't arrest her. He erased the crime by putting her soul into the building. He had traded his love for a lie. "You didn't do it to save the city," the voice of Sarah echoed in his mind. "You did it because you couldn't face the truth about who you loved." Miller realized then why the police had quit. They hadn't quit because of ghosts or monsters. They quit because they realized that every peaceful day in the city was paid for by the souls of the people they were supposed to protect. The police weren't the heroes. They were the jailers. "No more," Miller growled, his lungs burning as he dived toward the giant mirror at the bottom of the flood. As the mirror in the floor cracked, the water didn't pour out. It turned into light. Suddenly, Miller was standing in the hallway of apartment 404 again. The sun was shining through the dusty windows. The birds were singing outside. Sarah was standing next to him, looking at her watch. "You okay, Miller?" she asked, her voice normal and bright. "You've been staring at that door for a full minute. You look like you've seen a ghost." Miller looked at his hands. They were solid. He looked at his chest. His badge was there, shiny and new. The chains on the door were still unbroken. "Yeah," Miller said, his voice trembling. "I'm fine. Let's leave it. We're not going in." Sarah frowned. "What? We have a call. We have to check it out." Miller turned away and started walking toward the stairs. "No, tell the chief we're resigning, both of us. Right now." As they walked out of the building, Miller felt a weight in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out a small silver object. It was a police badge. It was scratched, dented, and covered in dried blood. On the back, it had a date from the future. He looked back up at the window of apartment 404. For a split second, he saw himself, the other Miller, standing at the glass, screaming for help. The loop hadn't ended. He hadn't escaped. He had just become the version of himself that was allowed to walk away until the next time the building got hungry. The case that made the police quit wasn't a case at all. It was a cycle. And as Miller threw his badge into the sewer, he knew the shadows would be waiting for him tomorrow.
If you like this story, please leave a like and drop a comment. Also, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next interesting story. We wish everybody watching a good health and light in our path.